All right, now let's talk about FlexBox or the flexible box layout. FlexBox, or sometimes called Flex, is basically a layout method for laying out elements in one dimension, like in a row or in a column. It's a lot easier and more powerful than floats. So let's start by creating a div with a class of container. Inside this div, we're going to have 3 divs, each with the class of box. So div.box times 3. Now let's give each box a label. So A, B, and C. So we're done here. Now let's define a bunch of rules. For our container, we're going to set the border to 3 pixels, solid, light, gray. And for our boxes, we're going to set the width to 5 rems, height to 5 rems, background to gold, and margin to 1 rem, so they're a little bit separated. And once again, I'm using rem unit here, but it doesn't mean you have to use rem. The unit we use really depends on what we're building. So let's see what we get up to this point. We get 3 boxes laid out vertically. Now, what if you want to lay these out horizontally? That's where we use Flex. A common application of this is in navigation bars, because in navigation bars, we have a bunch of menu items or hyperlinks laid out horizontally, right? So the first step is to go to this container and enable Flex. So we set the display property to Flex. Now, take a look. Our boxes are laid out horizontally with a single line of code. We didn't have to use floats. We didn't have to clear anything. We didn't have to deal with parent collapsing and so on. This is the beauty of Flex. So with Flex, we can lay out a bunch of elements in one direction, either in a row or in a column. We can control the direction by using the Flex direction property. The default value is row. That is why our boxes are laid out in a row. But we can set this to column, and now our boxes are laid out in a column. We also have column reverse. Now our boxes are laid out in the reverse order. So C, B, and A. And another possible value is row reverse. So our boxes are pushed to the right side, and first we have A, then B, and C. This is useful in right to left languages like Arabic, Farsi, and so on. I know my Persian friends are going to love this. So this is the direction. Now let's talk about alignment. To align items, you need to understand the concept of axis in Flex. In Flex, we have 2 axes, the main or the primary axis, and the cross or the secondary axis. These axes are dependent on the direction. So if we set the direction to row, the main axis is going to be the horizontal axis, and the cross axis is going to be the vertical axis. In contrast, if we set the direction to column, the main axis is going to be the vertical axis, whereas the cross axis is going to be the horizontal axis. Now, why does this matter? Well, using these axes, we can easily align items inside their container. Now, to align items, there are 2 properties you need to remember: justify content and align items. We use justify content to align items along the main or the primary axis. And we use the align items property to align items along the cross or the secondary axis. Now, the first time I saw these properties, I was wondering why the names are not consistent. Why isn't the second property called align content? Well, there is actually another property called align content. We'll talk about that shortly. But all I want you to remember for now is that we have 2 properties for aligning: justify content and align items. These are the properties that we use most of the time. So let's set the direction to row. Now, let's say we want to move these items to the end of the horizontal axis. This is where we use the justify content property. So here in our container, we set justify content to. The default value is flex start, but we can set it to flex end. And now our items are pushed to the end of the horizontal axis. We also have center. Our items are centered. This is very easy to achieve with FlexBox. We can also distribute these items along the horizontal axis. So here we have 3 properties: space evenly, which distributes our items with equal space in between them. We also have space between. Now, the first and the last items are pushed to the ends of the horizontal axis, and the other items are distributed with equal space between them. Now, you don't need to remember any of these. You can always play with these properties in the browser. So let's inspect this element. Let's select the container and look at the justify content property. So here is space between. We also have space around. With space around, we have some space before the first and after the last item, but the amount of space we have here is half of the space we have in between the other items. Again, you don't need to memorize anything, just play with these values in the browser to get the ideal look. So now let's set this back to center. Now, using the align items property, we can align these items along the cross or the secondary axis, which is in this case, the vertical axis. The default value is flex start, just like before, but we can set it to flex end to push these items to the end of the vertical axis. Now, in this case, nothing happens because there is not enough space in our container. Our container has gotten tall enough to fit these boxes. And that brings us to another important concept in Flex. Even though we set the display property to flex here, this container is still a block level element. So by default, it gets tall enough to fit its children. So on the outside, this element is a block level element, but on the inside, it behaves according to the FlexBox rules, okay? So now to align items vertically, first we have to give this container some height. So I'm going to set the height to 90 VH, which means 90% of the viewport height. So we have a lot of space here, and our boxes are pushed to the end of the vertical axis. Now we can also set this to center. See, with Flex, it's so easy to put an element in the center of a container. This wasn't very easy in the past, but with Flex, all we have to do is to set these 4 properties. So we covered justify content and align items, but what about align content? Well, this property only works if we have multiple lines in our Flex container. Currently, we have a single line, but let's add a few more boxes to create a second line. So back to our markup, let's duplicate this line a few times. C, D, E, F, and G. We still have one line. Now look at the size of these boxes. I'm going to add one more box. Let's see what happens. Our boxes got smaller. This is the default behavior of a Flex container. These items get smaller so they can fit on one line. We can change this behavior using the flex wrap property. So here in our container, we set flex wrap to. The default value is no wrap. That is why the items fit on one line. But if it changes to wrap, now items keep their original size, and any extra items that cannot fit on one line wrap onto a second line, okay? So earlier when we had a single line, we put our elements in the center of the vertical axis. But now that we have multiple lines, look, our elements are not quite in the center. The first line is closer to the beginning of the vertical axis, and the second line is closer to the end. This is where the align content property comes to play. With this property, we can align multiple lines or the entire content as a whole. So we can put the entire content in the center of the vertical axis. And with this, we get this beautiful layout. Now let's get rid of these extra boxes and simplify our code. Now back to our style sheet. Because we have a single line, we no longer need the flex wrap and align content properties. So we have 3 boxes in the center of our container. Now, what if you want to change the alignment of one of these boxes? Like, what if you want to move the first box to the top? This is where we use the align self property. So first, we give this box an extra class, like box 1. We could call it anything. We could also use pseudo class selectors, but let's not worry about them and focus entirely on Flex. Now, back to our style sheet. Let's define a new rule. So for box 1, we're going to set align self to flex start. So align self is a property that we apply on a Flex item and not a Flex container. With this, we can overwrite the value that we assigned earlier using the align items property, okay? So let's see what we get. The first box moved to the top. We can also move it down by setting it to flex end. Okay? Now let's remove this line. We don't need it anymore. So this is all about aligning. Now let's talk about sizing. There are a few properties you need to remember. One is flex basis, which is used for setting the initial size of a Flex item. We have flex grow for setting the growth factor, flex shrink for setting the shrink factor, and flex, which is a shorthand property that combines all the top 3 properties. Now, all these properties should be applied on Flex items and not Flex containers. So let's see them in action. So back to our box, we can use the Flex Bases property to set the initial size of our boxes. Now, by default, this is set to auto, which means the browser is going to look at the width property. So now nothing is going to happen. However, if we change this to, let's say, 10 rem, this is going to overwrite the width property. The reason this is happening is because we have set the direction to row, so Flex Bases translates to the width property. If we set the direction to column, Flex Bases would translate to height, okay? So now look, our boxes are bigger. Now we can apply this property on an individual item as well. For example, for our first box, we can set Flex Bases to 5 rems. So our first box is now smaller. So we don't need this line anymore. And let's set Flex Bases back to 5. So 3 boxes just like before. Now, the second property we're going to talk about is Flex Grow, which determines the growth factor of our Flex items. So currently our boxes are each 5 rems, and we have plenty of extra space available. With Flex Grow, we can allow these items to grow and take up the available space. So by default, Flex Grow is set to 0. That is why our boxes are not growing. But if we set it to 1, now all these boxes are growing at the same factor. We can change the growth factor for 1 or more boxes. For example, for our first box, we can set Flex Grow to 0, and this prevents the first box from growing. So all the available space is now allocated to the second and third boxes. Now we can change this to 2. Now you can see the first box has grown more than the other boxes. Now you might be wondering why the first box is not twice as big as the other boxes. Well, this is a common misconception about the Flex Grow property. Just because we set the Flex Grow to 2 for the first box, it doesn't mean this box is going to be twice as wide as the other boxes. Let me explain how growing works. So I'm going to comment out this property and this other Flex Grow property. So back to the original situation. We have plenty of space here, right? Now, when we set the Flex Grow property, the browser is going to look at the growth factor of each of these boxes. For the first box, the growth factor is 2. And for the 2 other boxes, the growth factor is 1. So 2 plus 1 plus 1 is 4. So the browser is going to take up the entire available space, divided by 4 slices. Then it's going to allocate 2 slices to A, 1 slice to B, and 1 slice to C. This is how this algorithm works. So this is Flex Grow. Now we have another property called Flex Shrink, which is the opposite of Flex Grow. It tells the browser how these elements should shrink if there is not enough space to fit in the container. So for this demo, I'm going to change the initial size of our boxes to 15 rems. And then let's set Flex Shrink to 1. This is the default value. So our boxes are bigger. But if you resize the browser window, look, they're shrinking at the same rate. Now, back to our box 1. Here we can set Flex Shrink to 0 to prevent it from shrinking. So look, the first box is maintaining its original size, which is 15 rems, whereas the other boxes have shrunk. So Flex Shrink is the opposite of Flex Grow, okay? Now let's delete this line. We don't need it anymore. So Flex Bases, Flex Grow, and Flex Shrink. Now we have this Flex property, which is a shorthand for these properties. If we supply a single value, that is going to be used for the Flex Grow property, okay? If we supply 2 values, the second value can be Flex Shrink or Flex Bases. And one thing I want you to note here is that Flex Grow and Flex Shrink just take a number. They don't take a unit. So 1 is the growth factor. It's not 1 pixel or 1 rem or whatever, okay? So if we supply 2 values, the second value can either be the Flex Bases or Flex Shrink. And if we supply 3 values, the first value is going to be Grow, the second is going to be Shrink, and the third is going to be Flex Bases. Now, I know there is a lot to digest. We covered a lot in this lesson, but trust me, Flex is easier than you think. As you practice it more, it becomes second nature.